Welcome to the BLUF, the bottom line up front with the FBI AIA. With us today is one of our AIA members, Sasha Taylor. So Sasha, what's the BLUF for today?
Thank you so much, Sierra. Today we're discussing a legislative framework I wrote for preventing honor-based violence in immigrant and refugee populations who reside in Virginia. And for our listeners who are unfamiliar with the term, honor-based violence and its sub-practices are multiple forms of abuse, coercion, and control in a collective family or community system. It occurs mainly in segregated immigrant and refugee populations, leading marginalized lives in which gender inequality, the value of a girl's virginity, and sexual segregation are embedded in unwritten codes of honor and shame.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for joining us today and not only educating us about this very important issue, but also outlining everything that you are doing to address it. So my name is Sierra Stanchek. I'll go through the more formal introduction of what we're doing. So I am the COO of the FBI Association of Intelligence Analysts, and this is one of our podcast virtual event series where we get to platform our members and different topics of interest to not only our FBI AIA membership, but also to our wider community. So a little bit about the FBI AIA. It was formed in late 2021 by a small group of former FBI analysts who sought to build a community to advance the careers of intelligence analysts in the private sector and government through mentoring, networking, advocacy, and programming like today's event. And I will turn it back over to you, Sasha, to tell us a little bit about your background first, and then more about honor-based violence and the framework that you've authored to help inform policies to address this.
Absolutely. So I joined the FBI in 2010, and I was mainly in the counterterrorism division, and then the weapons of mass destruction directorate. And when I left the FBI in 2021, I um, I noticed that it had been almost 30 years since my own forced child marriage had occurred. And during my time in the FBI, my colleagues didn't know that I was in a forced child marriage and a victim of honor-based violence. During my time at the FBI, I was in, like I said, in CTD and WMD. I'd covered various subject matters, including East Africa, the Middle East, Asia. And when I left, the fall of Afghanistan happened, and it had been almost 30 years since my own forced child marriage. And when I left, I said, okay, you know what? Not much has changed. A lot of the girls that were escaping from Afghanistan were also being forced into child marriages. And that's when I started my own consultancy. I had still been doing some advocacy work while I was at the FBI. I just wasn't very public about it, very not vocal about it. And that's when I started more public advocacy work. And that's when I started my own consultancy and advocacy campaigns and said, okay, this is the time for me to become more active in this space. And it's been 4 years since.
So you left the FBI, and then what happened to catalyze your efforts for creating this framework?
This framework is so needed to tell an immigrant life story from when they arrive in the United States to moving forward. And after after I left the bureau, and the fall of Afghanistan happened, and there's so many girls who are coming to the United States trying to get an education that they weren't able to get in Afghanistan. And then I find out about the fact that their own family members are trying to get them forcefully married off, and in some cases, sending them back to Afghanistan. And there's so many stories like that that have been happening for years and years and years that I think go unnoticed, unheard, unrecognized, because in the immigrant community, there are many stories, many lives that center around this concept of shame. This, honor-based violence is about shame. It's about bringing shame to um, the family, about why why a girl is not doing what the family wants them to do. Anything she does brings shame to a family, and this fear of integration into a new society. That's why you have very insular societies when an immigrant community arrives in another country, into a Western country. And that's why there's this fear that if we do anything that is outside of our culture, of our traditions, of our religion, that it's just going to just destroy everything that we have worked so hard to create. And that's where that fear of westernization comes in, which is the source of honor-based violence. Or even if a girl looks at somebody else, then, her virginity might be at risk. And that's why she's forcefully married off, or married off, child marriages and all of that that occurs in honor-based violence. And so that's something that I think from a Western point of view, and I say Western point of view just because here in the United States, we tend to view everything that is not happening here in the United States from a very Orientalist point of view, just like, oh, that's just something that's cultural, that's okay, that's something they do, and we fail to recognize what's healthy and what's not healthy, and we excuse unhealthy practices. And I wanted to put on paper a framework saying, no, this is not okay. We have to put on paper what is not okay and actually pass laws saying what's not okay, what laws we need to pass in this country, especially laws that are understood by by the people that are coming here in the United States, the new Americans that are coming into the United States. Because let's face it, a lot of people who are coming here do not understand the words trafficking. The laws that we have created here are outdated. They work for certain scenarios. Yes, there is trafficking happening here, but honor-based violence, they don't see themselves as being trafficked. It's grooming and it's forced marriage. And yes, there may be some trafficking elements to it, but it's not the same. And so we have to put a different framework in place for an immigrant life story to be able to help them.
So, did anything from your time with the FBI intersect or inform this type of work that you can talk about? And when did you start seeing those intersections? And
Right away, actually. So I would say the first case I ever read when I got to the FBI, I informed the agent. There's a lot of cases that I have read where I've reached out to somebody and I've discussed it with somebody saying, hey, this is not okay, or you may want to look into this, or there's trafficking happening and visa fraud, definitely visa fraud, when it intersects with national security. And um, attempts at forced marriage. And we need to remember that a lot of our refugee and immigrant communities are displaced. There's multiple statuses, and some people come here because they want to, and some people come here because they have to apply for different statuses. So we need to remember, even within those umbrella terms, there's various statuses. And, you know, people are vulnerable when they first arrive here because they're rebuilding their lives. And we need to remember that they are vulnerable. They're rebuilding their lives in another country. But there was a recent case that I read. It happened in another state where there was a organization saying, "Oh, we'll sponsor you," like a women's empowerment, trying to bring women in for a women in STEM job opportunities here, a front company, and it turned out it was trafficking women into the United States, and it was horrible what they were doing, and I was just like, oh my gosh, there's so many ways to take advantage of individuals from another country. And as government and even the private sector, we cannot just think that an issue is just happening within a silo. There's so many intersections.
You mentioned in the framework, and we'll provide resources alongside this video and audio about the framework itself and language used and information about you and your organization. But you use the term New Americans. And so let's start with that, and then let's dive into other elements of the framework.
Really quick. So I'm on the Office of New Americans for the Governor's Advisory Board here in Virginia. And New Americans are anyone who enters the United States as immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And there's a few points I want to highlight. Um, New Americans are, it's New Americans and their children. And a few points I want to highlight on the framework. It discusses the prevalence of honor violence abuses, which includes familial trafficking. Again, not every instance of honor violence is familial trafficking, but it does occur within it. That's taking place in immigrant and refugee communities within their own households. It highlights how these laws can prevent um, and empower community building relationships between these new American communities and first responders. I think there's a huge gap. Um, and that gap comes from the fear of new Americans speaking up. And we'll go into that in a little bit. And it discusses the role that school district officials have in maintaining a steady communication and emphasizing a STEM pipeline for new American students from middle school into college and onwards. And the framework seeks to empower new Americans, and we know that a majority of the world recognizes crimes against women and girls as forms of honor-based violence. And as we welcome refugees from multiple parts of the world in which honor-based violence occurs, it's global. We have to update our own laws to reflect the same to protect the populations that are resettling here in the United States, which is why a legislative framework from community level to state level and hopefully at the federal level is necessary. And this is the first one ever written in Virginia and in the United States. It also provides updates to some existing laws in Virginia. So that's what that does. I've written some new laws, which are so necessary. And then there are some laws that are here in Virginia that I personally think just need some updating, which can help new Americans a lot.
So that's one of the great things about the framework that stood out to me was that it's something that can be adapted and picked up and used to modify or update existing laws throughout the United States. Again, with that community aspect and that community building at the forefront. But then if a state has a clear gap in what the framework can address, it already has ready-made language baked in so that it's very easy for policymakers and legislators to get a head start, and I think most importantly, speaking the same language so that isn't unique to one certain area or one certain culture. It's something that can happen really anywhere.
It starts with psychological abuse, and it can go from psychological abuse to guilt to physical violence to forced marriage. And if all of that is rejected, then it can go to an honor killing fast. You know, we always say that there's that one chance rule. So if a girl approaches law enforcement or anybody, a teacher or somebody saying, I am being abused at home, and if it's a refugee or an immigrant, saying that they're being forced into a marriage, their family's trying to take them abroad to marry them off, they may only get one chance to help them. Um, and we always tell our first responders, our law enforcement, to take even something as simple as a girl saying, my family's not letting me speak to this friend group who was not the same background as me, or not the same culture as me, or I'm not able to go hang out with my friends after a certain time, and things like that. Seriously, because these kind of issues are a big deal when it comes to refugee and immigrant communities. I mean, I was not allowed to go out and hang out with my friends unless my brothers were there with me, even as an adult.
Like you pointed out, there really isn't anything standardized about how we talk about it, how we deal with it. So when we're talking about, and you talked about earlier about that first time, that first report, maybe being the only time that it can be addressed. Why do you think that in the cases where those indicators are detected, that they might not necessarily be met with a sense of urgency that you know they probably warrant, or that those indicators might be ignored?
I describe it as the immigration conversation is bookmarked. That means that it's focused on the legal paperwork in the beginning and then completely ignored. And then you find out that the police is called, protection order is in place over an attempted child marriage or forced marriage or extreme forms of domestic abuse or an honor killing or a murder that has taken place. And then we hear, you hear nothing in the middle. So it is so important for anybody listening to this to understand that protecting immigrant girls and women is so important, and why honor-based violence goes from honor abuse to honor killing so fast, or that girl goes from abuse to getting on a plane with her family, forcing her on a plane, forcefully marrying her off to somebody like that.
Can this framework help new Americans and first responders?
I'll start with new Americans first. You know, immigrant and refugee families hold really tightly to their culture and tradition, which is great. We love positive culture and traditions. I have them in my own family. You know, we celebrate them. But we also have to remember that in general, crime also occurs in a cultural construct, and our laws are behind in passing legislation that recognizes that crime is occurring to refugee and immigrants inside their own households in a cultural construct. And our laws are old and need to be updated. I hear that all the time from lawmakers. And every first responder agency is only as good as their training and their relationship with their communities. And we have a very, very diverse community. And also as good as the laws that we enforce, right? So it's like this constant circle. And all of this cannot happen without proper honor violence education to local and state law enforcement, because honor violence is what the majority of refugees and immigrants recognize. And this can easily be added to existing new police training structure, which includes a full day honor-based violence training, building trust with local new American communities, identification and communication with potential victims, approaching victims with empathy, understanding, building trust, trauma-informed care training, identifying multiple forms of honor-based violence and how to respond to it. I mean, it's literally a one-day training with, you know, new law enforcement training. It's really just something that every police academy can do to their training structure.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that stands out to me with the framework and how you just described that 1 day training that would take awareness leaps and bounds forward is that the framework is not specific to certain communities or certain cultures. There are clear patterns and clear indicators, regardless of the context, for honor based violence. And I think that makes it a lot easier for first responders, but even spreading this awareness, this framework to them and to schools, social workers, others, even outside of first responders. What does that child experience specifically during this process? How does that relate to this framework, in the sense of the child taking on the invisible burden of what comes with the immigration process and how that translates within the immigrant household?
So many immigrant families have a difficult time understanding the academic needs of their children, which means that the children have to take on a parentification or an adultification role. And this burdens the child to navigate their own school or college experience, um, while also dealing with the trauma of integrating into a new school, society, and family life in another country. And this also means that this child may become, a primary caretaker of their siblings or the elderly in the household while trying to advocate for themselves in school. I mean, this child is burdened with so many roles while being a new American as a potential minor in the United States.
Part of your framework when we're talking about school subjects addressed STEM specifically. So you talk about in your framework a STEM pipeline that you recommend. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
That comes from, I wanted to be an engineer and I was forced into my child marriage, and I never got to do my own engineering degree. So I'm all about STEM education or just education in general, but I never saw a school counselor. I never visited a career counselor. And that goes back to being unaware about advocating for my social emotional needs and my parents not knowing how to advocate for my social emotional needs. And I truly believe in the school district, you know, like training and training and training their school liaison and school counselor robustly to ensure that the needs of new American children are met and every opportunity is available to them. And we can provide and make sure it's a consistent pipeline, not for somebody to constantly be searching for that. I think that we need to have a consistent pipeline where the the refugee and immigrant community has one place to go for that pipeline instead of just navigating and just constantly searching for it. And I think that it's so important for them to find that pipeline to be successful, because I mean it's difficult to navigate this space when they get here.
So, with the framework, it calls for recommendations and legislation proposals. And it definitely is through that lens of Virginia law, but again, this is a framework that can be picked up and applied in multiple jurisdictions. But when we're speaking about Virginia specifically, what are your proposals? How do you foresee Virginia being best suited in integrating this framework into what they have now or what they might need to build?
I wrote a suggested legislation for honor-based violence and honor killing. In the language, I wrote that any attempt to cause harm, serious injury, exploitation, coercion, deception, fraud, or trafficking to anyone on the basis of so-called honor will be subjected to a Class 3 felony. I mean, it's really simple language. And the same for honor-based killing, a Class 2 felony or a Class 1 felony. And then in Virginia, we already passed child marriage law, but we do not have forced marriage, specifically stating forced marriage. Now, refugees.org is a phenomenal nonprofit, and they specifically did a study that said that in our trafficking federal law, in our federal law for trafficking, we do not have a forced marriage clause. And that has been failing many women for years because they are unable to get um, access to services the way a lot of trafficking survivors are able to access. And also, a lot of cases for TVPA are forced marriage
And what is
and
the TVPA?
Trafficking Victims Protection Act.
Okay, thank you.
And also transnational marriage abandonment is very common, and that came out really, really in the open with lots of articles about it during COVID-19, when a lot of women who have been living in the United States, their husbands have visas, and they are literally abandoned by their spouse. So either they're brought into the United States, abandoned here, or their spouse is a US citizen who either takes them back to their country and then abandons them there and then comes back. So updated proposals are cousin marriages. There's a lot of girls who have been taken abroad and forcefully married off to their cousin. And that I am asking for update to a Virginia law, which says you cannot marry your family member. And I'm just saying, hey, you just need to add cousin marriage to that. Bride price. I'm saying, hey, we have already an existing law saying child selling is illegal, naturally, and you need to just add the words bride price in there. And dowry, we have a dowry law here. We just need to update it to reflect current exploitation of dowry. Breast ironing, that can be included on in child abuse laws. Scarification, same thing, that can be included in child abuse laws.
I believe the framework covers an expansion of definitions of harm, exploitation, coercion, deception, fraud, and trafficking. Again, these are not specific to immigrant communities, they're not specific to certain parts of American society. This is, hey, these are different things that happen that are in violation of US laws. So, can you briefly go through how these specific terms are expanded to include honor-based violence for your framework?
Absolutely. So I need everybody to understand what happens when honor-based violence is occurring. And that's what I did in these definitions, because unless we add what's happening in honor-based violence, we cannot begin to understand it from a law enforcement point of view, recognize it when we see it, um, from a refugee and immigrant point of view, in empowering the community, you know, the community themselves not being able to recognize what's happening to them and then speaking up as a community. You know, one of the biggest issues we have is the silence of the community is so loud. And we have to pass these laws to empower the community so they themselves can recognize that, oh, honor violence is illegal here. Oh, okay. All right. Because at the end of the day, it's about them.
Do you, from all of that, have a new appreciation from being in this policy and advocacy and advising space, um, and as well as law development space, coming from your lived experience and then intelligence background?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm mostly enjoying having these multiple roles, you know, as a consultant. I enjoy the privilege of using my FBI experience to draft frameworks and inform customers on gaps and mitigation strategies that can help multiple stakeholders and help them in their capacity building and sustainability and future growth. And then you know, as I said, I was recently invited to co-chair the Policy and Legislation Subcommittee for the DC Human Trafficking Task Force. And in that role, I'm restricted by the same big DOJ rules that we all went by at the FBI, but I can still inform our customers on what the key issues are. And in that role, I cannot make policy, just inform, which comes easy for me being former FBI. And I'm thankful, you know, in being in that role um, as a part of my lived experience, and that the group acknowledges that I bring a viewpoint that some may not have. And I'm thankful that survivors with key skills are being recognized as having superpowers. And then in my survivor advocate role, I attend congressional roundtables with survivor founded nonprofits and additional government entities, and also with international lawmakers as we inform and advocate for anti-trafficking bills, and then get briefed by Congress on bills that they are drafting, and then we get first look at federal bills about to be introduced, and then we get to chord on them. My chord days are still here. And then the three big federal legislative efforts that we're advocating include the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, which aims to provide relief for trafficking survivors, and then the Gracie Act, which requires states to record Child Protective Services interviews, and National Human Trafficking Database Act, and requires states to record all initial CPS interviews, and then create a trafficking database. It's what it sounds like. So it's nice to basically, you can say, like, doing this at like the grassroots with advocating for state laws, and then writing my own policy and legislation with the framework at the state and community level, and providing just providing, you know, framework for what an immigrant life story looks like from beginning to end, and how we can make that better from community, state, you know, level, and then federal level. So I'm literally involved in community, state, federal level, and each has its own roles. So it's nice to be basically, you know, do a little bit of work everywhere on the policy level, and then be a part of the sisterhood of survivor. You know, survivor sisterhood is just gosh, these amazing, amazing women who are just phenomenal, just this powerhouse of women who are basically the key behind passing all these laws. And they are just, gosh, they're so powerful.
They're making it happen just like you.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
love
thank you.
it. So I'm just super appreciative that you came on today to talk about this very important issue and educate our listeners. I'm confident our listeners will walk away learning a lot more, having a better understanding, have much more awareness, and hopefully infected by your passion to get involved and reach out to you and support you. And we will make sure that your website information and on any other resources are shared alongside this media so that people have a clear way to make contact and support your work in whatever capacity that they're able to and willing to. But yeah, I wanted to offer you the opportunity to close out this episode with any remarks. And after we do that, we will close out this session and look forward to future episodes of the BLUF with the FBI AIA. But Sasha, let's turn it over to you to close out.
Just an honor to have been a part of the FBI and now be a part of the AIA. So thank you for that. And be here speaking with you and for giving me this platform. I appreciate it. Um, I just want to say that we have to remember that the laws are made to protect citizens from harm. I'm going to repeat that. Laws are made to protect citizens from harm. The language of the various forms of harms that are occurring to a group of people, new Americans that are arriving here with this dream of living here and having a good life. We have completely failed to protect them. And our lawmakers need to understand that.